Today I'm here to talk about my top 10 fantasy books published in 2024. These are the best books according to me based off my personal taste. I'd love to hear your recommendations and favorites down below. Definitely subscribe if you haven't yet. And all that being said, let's get into the books. First, at number 10, we have The Wind That Sweeps the Star by Greg Keyes. This is a standalone fantasy story, so one that's great to pick up if you don't want to commit to a full long series. And in it, we follow a woman who at the beginning of the story is committed to this marriage. It's supposed to be this political arrangement in order to keep the peace. However, that is potentially not the case as it is implied in the book, and there is more to this woman that is going on. She is skilled at the job of assassin work, and again, this is all in the back of the book, and then the story progresses from there. I've read this author before and really enjoyed the way that he tells fantasy. It's perhaps a little bit predictable and tropey, but at the same time, it's very well done. This was just an enjoyable book to read. Again, a short one to fly through, and sometimes it's just nice to have those palate cleanser. I'm definitely going to have some chunky monkeys on this list, so this is a great one to recommend. Again, if you want to get in and get out and have a satisfying read between some of your big series. Then at number 9, we have The Fee Hunter by Selene Goldenberg, and this is one that follows a fee hunter, or essentially a demon hunter. At the beginning of the story, they make an agreement to help escort this woman through the forest, and with that, their stories become intertwined. This is one that is more small in nature, so it feels more intimate and character focused than some of the other epic fantasy I'll be talking about on this list. I really enjoyed it just because while it is not completely subverting the tropes, in some ways it felt quite fresh because there is, again, a lot of epic fantasy that has come quite popular right now, and so having something that is more in the nature of demon slaying and all of that, which is its own genre, of course. I just really enjoyed this one. I flew through it. It was easy to read. It was fun. It had some good darker moments with the demons, but certainly it's more fantasy than horror, so know that going in. But if you enjoy something up this alley and want to try it out, I don't feel like this book is getting enough love online. I really enjoyed it, and I think a lot of you will too. Then at number 8, we have The Lotus Empire by Tasha Suri. This is the third and final book in a trilogy that is inspired by Indian culture. We follow the perspective of these two strong women within the story. There is a sapphic romance element to it, and really you have these characters vying for the throne and dealing with the political upheaval that is happening within the first two books. I don't want to give away more of the plot than that, but just know that if you enjoy stories told from different cultural perspectives that are kind of non-Western and non-European, this is something that I found to be quite fresh in that regard and has some really strong character building. It's one that definitely grows with the characters, where again you see their journey and how far they have come since the original story. I enjoyed this one. I thought it was well done in terms of both the characters but also the world building, and just a solid story. Good conclusion. If you enjoy the first two books, definitely pick up the third. I think it's a solid conclusion that I think you'll be satisfied with, or at least I was. Next, we have Blood of the Old Kings by Sung Il Kim, and this is a story that is translated from Korean in which it was written. It is in a society that is run by necromancy, so they use the dead bodies of sorcerers in order to run the society, and we follow someone who is destined to have that same fate. However, they are contacted or reached out to, or at least hear the voice of a dead sorcerer telling them to go and take another path, and the story goes from there. This one I adore in premise. The idea of using the bodies of these sorcerers to run the electricity and the power of this nation. I adore the darkness of that concept. It's something that immediately drew me in. This one suffers a touch in my mind with the translation, or at least it appears to, that I didn't love the writing and the storytelling. I felt overly simplified, and I don't know again if that was lost in translation or if that is representative of the original work. So it's a story that's fantastic in terms of premise and is perhaps more simplistic than I would like it to be, but given the fact that it is the type of story that is very much up my alley, despite those quibbles, obviously it's on this list, I really enjoyed it. Just know going in that if you're someone who loves complex prose and really nuanced stories, this one is a little bit straight on the nail, but I still enjoyed my time with it. I would love to see more by this author. I'd love to see what else they can do, and if their mind goes to the same dark places that mine does, I think that we will find some good potential here. I enjoyed this one, and again, knowing a lot of you share my taste, I think it's at least worth trying out. Next up, we have The Silver Blood Promise by James Logan. This is the first book in a new epic fantasy series where we follow a man who is a disgraced heir. He has turned away from that life, and is now a gambler, a drinker, and just really having a party, living out his life and ignoring the duties that he was born into. However, that changes when his father dies. And again, this is all in the back of the book. I'm very careful when it comes to giving away too much. And so from there, he goes out to seek out what happened and potentially get revenge on his father and kind of find his place within the world that he was born into and has really turned away from. It is a plot that I think is immediately likable and really sucks you in. I love that the main character is not a perfect pretty boy. Instead, he very much has flaws. He's in somewhat, not really morally gray, but definitely has his own agenda. He makes decisions for himself. He's quite selfish at the start, and so you see a lot of character development even within this one. And as I mentioned, it's the start of a series, so I'm not entirely sure how many more books are planned, but certainly you can see the potential there. So I'm really excited to see where it goes because this first book was a solid start. Lots of great potential for great things to come. And I really enjoyed it. I think if you love a story that is both epic in nature, but also kind of focused around the grittiness of urban life, I really have come to love that type of fantasy, which is really what attracted me to the start of this one, where you have a bit of a character, again, just in the bars and going about. And then, of course, there's a larger story underneath it. So kind of the best of both worlds for me. I really enjoyed it, and I think a lot of you will too if you decide to check it out. Then breaking into the number 5 spots, we have The Fury of the Gods, the third and final book in the trilogy that starts with The Shadow of the Gods. This is Viking-inspired fantasy told from multiple perspectives. The one I always focus on is the one I most personally connect with is this mother perspective, where something happens at the beginning of the first book to her family that causes her to have to go on this great adventure. And so this is wrapping up the story. I think it's very much on par with the first 2 books. If you love the characters, you will be very happy, I think, with some of the development that you see here, and you get some exciting moments, but also, again, some personal moments. I thought it was very fitting and worked very well within the narrative. So again, if you enjoy the story, definitely go finish it out. If you haven't read it yet, do start back at the beginning, because while this book is great, it is certainly not a standalone and is very much built on the foundations of the first 2 books. Then at the number 4 spot, we have The Blood Dim Tide by Stefan Aaron, the second book in this Mongol-inspired historical fantasy series. And so in this one, it really solidified my love for the series as a whole, because while I liked the first book, I felt like it was very much a series start and didn't give me enough time to really establish the world and the cultural details I was looking for. This book really provided that. It just allowed me to spend more time in the world, as you would imagine with a sequel. And as well, I found that the writing was even stronger. Again, I liked the writing in the first book, but this really felt like a step up in terms of how polished it was, and you can just see the experience that comes with writing more books. And so I really enjoyed this one. I'm looking forward to more in this series. Highly recommend. Again, you want to start back at the beginning in order to understand the series. It is meant to be read sequentially, but absolutely check it out if you love Mongol culture the way I do. If you're fascinated by it, this is so interesting. I often think I'm not someone who enjoys historical fantasy, but books like this really prove that it's just about finding the right book at the right period of time. And this book just loved it. Highly recommend. I think a lot of you will like it too. I've got to stop saying that, but there's a reason I'm making this list, is that I really want a lot of you to try out these books that in some cases, like this one, I don't think are getting enough attention online. Then at number 3, we have The Night Ends with Fire by K.S. Song. This is a story that follows a young Chinese girl who at the beginning of the story is going to be sacrificed or sold off by her father to feed his opium addiction. However, she escapes the life that she is going to be sent into and instead disguises herself as a boy and goes and learns and trains. This is one that felt very reminiscent of the Poppy War, as well as She Who Became the Sun, which happened to be 2 of my favorite series. And so naturally, anything similar really draws my attention. I will say that, again, this book is going to feel perhaps a touch predictable if you've read some of those. It leans into similar tropes and storylines, but for me, for whatever reason, it's a plot that really sucks me in. This one is often being pitched as a Mulan retelling in a way, and I certainly see pieces of that there and very much enjoyed it. But again, as the story progresses, it does become its own. The author has a strong voice, and I think if you love that story of a young girl or woman having to overcome her place again in a historical setting, that does not favor the place of women and sees them more as property to be bought and sold, and instead really finding her voice and her place by disguising herself as a man. I'm a sucker for that. I really love the things that are done in this story, so highly recommend. I love this one so much, and I again love to see more people picking it up. Then at number 2 we have Mirrored Heavens by Rebecca Roanhorse, the third and final book in the trilogy that begins with Black Sun. This is a multi-POV point of view story that has different perspectives, melding together different cultural elements from different aspects and places in the world. So we have these indigenous viewpoints, we have a character who represents the sirens of this world, and so there is part of this book or series that involves sailing, and then this of course is the accumulation of the story up to this point. I can't talk about plot at all, but I'll say that it's a very character-driven story, one that I got completely immersed in. I have reread the first book several times, I've reread the second now, and just got swept back into the story once again. I really feel it pulls it all together. Again, if you're already attached to the characters, I found this one to be so satisfying and emotional in all the best ways, and I love seeing it come together. It does have a touch of romance within the story, but it's really first and foremost this fantastical story with these great stakes, and again, characters you care about, which means you care what's going to happen to them, which for me makes a final book oh so more important, and I feel they completely nailed the ending. I love this one. I thought it was solid through and through. Highly recommend not just this book but the whole series, because again, you want to start back at the beginning with Black Sun. Then at the number 1 spot, the book that nothing could beat out this year, of course, was The Trials of Empire by Richard Swan, the third and final book in the series that begins with the Justice of Kings. We follow the story from this particular standpoint of the scribe who follows along this man who is Von Wald. He is this detective. He is also a judge and an executioner laying out the king's law throughout the land. And so rather than having the story from his perspective, again, we get it from Helena, who is following him around. And that is where the story begins in book 1. As we progress, there are larger stakes within these later books, and I got completely swept into it. For me, the real treat of the story, the real thing that draws me in, is the bond between our main characters. And so we follow them as they are going through these great trials and seeing how the story progresses. Of course, on top of that, there is action, there is political intrigue, there is maneuvering, and I feel like each of these books just somehow gets better and better, and I adore this final book. I think it's right on par for the first 2. The writing in all these stories is fantastic. Again, the character development is some of the best. This is not just one of my favorite books of the year, but this whole series is easily one of my new favorite series, and so you'll absolutely see it when I do an updated fantasy list. Let me know if you want me to do that soon, because it's just such an incredibly well-crafted story. And if anything, it makes other things I'm comparing it to, when I read all the new releases when it comes to fantasy, I knew that nothing else was going to compare, because there's just a quality level when you get something that is so well produced and put together that is just so hard for anything else to compare against, and everything else just paled. If you're only going to pick up one series this year, this is the one I recommend. I was enamored by it. I'm engrossed by this series. I just want to reread it over and over again. And again, I think so many of you will love it. It has so much to offer, and it's just a really smart series. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And also recommend me your favorite fantasy that was published in 2024. If I missed it this year, I will definitely check it out next year. Don't forget to stick around, subscribe if you enjoy this kind of content, because I do have my favorite science fiction coming in the next week or so, so hopefully you stick around. And if you want to help me out with this video, I appreciate a thumbs up, dropping a comment, even if just an emoji, and hitting that little notification bell. Otherwise, I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.